The morning sun cast long shadows across San Francisco International Airport's Terminal 2 as passengers lined up at Gate 23. Among them stood David Chen, briefcase in one hand and designer coffee in the other, checking his Rolex for the third time in 5 minutes. At 45, he'd finally made it to where he thought he deserved to be, Senior Vice President of Marketing at a Fortune 500 company. First-class passengers may now begin boarding, announced the gate agent, her voice clear and professional over the intercom. David straightened his Italian silk tie and strode forward, purposefully brushing past a couple who were fumbling with their carry-on bags. "Excuse me," he said, though his tone suggested they should be the ones apologizing for existing in his path. The promotion had gone to his head, as his co-workers might say, if they dared to say anything at all these days. The jet bridge stretched before him like a red carpet, and David walked down it with the air of someone who believed they owned it. He'd worked 15 years for this, the right to turn left instead of right when boarding, to sit in those spacious seats at the front of the plane, to sip champagne before takeoff, while others squeezed past with their oversized backpacks. "Good morning, sir. Welcome aboard." The flight attendant greeted him with a warm smile. David barely nodded in response, too busy surveying his domain for the day. The first-class cabin of Flight 2187 to New York. His seat, 2C, was positioned perfectly, an aisle seat with easy access to everything. As he stored his briefcase in the overhead compartment, he made sure everyone could see the Gucci logo. Little details mattered in first class, he thought. They separated the truly successful from the merely lucky. Other passengers began filtering into the cabin. A woman in a smart business suit took her seat in the front row. An elderly gentleman settled into his window seat with practiced ease. Then came someone who made David's perfectly trimmed eyebrows rise with disapproval. The man wore a plain black t-shirt that had seen better days, faded jeans, and what appeared to be years-old sneakers. His hair looked like he'd just rolled out of bed, and he was completely absorbed in whatever he was looking at on his phone. This shabby figure made his way to 2D, directly across the aisle from David. "You've got to be kidding me," David muttered under his breath, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. He pulled out his phone and fired off a quick text to his assistant. "First class really isn't what it used to be. They're letting anyone in these days." The casually dressed man didn't seem to notice or care about David's disapproving glares. He simply sat down, still focused on his phone, occasionally typing with intense concentration. No briefcase, no laptop bag, just a small backpack that he tucked under the seat in front of him. As the remaining passengers boarded, David made sure to speak extra loudly on his phone. "Yes, I'll be leading the meeting with the board tomorrow. We're talking 9 figures here minimum." He paused for effect, glancing around to see who was impressed. Of course, that's just the initial phase. A flight attendant approached with pre-departure drinks. "Would you like champagne, orange juice, or water, sir?" she asked David. "Champagne, of course," David replied, as if any other choice would be unconscionable. "I hope it's properly chilled this time. Last month on my flight to Chicago, it was practically room temperature." He shuddered at the memory, real or imagined. The flight attendant maintained her professional smile and turned to the man across the aisle. But before she could speak, David interrupted with another comment pitched to Carrie. "I remember when first class meant something, you know. When people dressed for the occasion, when it was exclusive." He shot a pointed look at the t-shirt-clad man. Several other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The elderly gentleman by the window cleared his throat disapprovingly. But David was on a roll now, emboldened by what he perceived as tacit agreement from his fellow real first-class passengers. "I mean, look at Silicon Valley these days," he continued, ostensibly speaking to no one in particular, but clearly targeting his across-aisle neighbor. "Any kid who can cobble together an app thinks they belong here. They'd probably bought their ticket with daddy's money or some crypto scam." The man in the t-shirt remained absorbed in his phone, either genuinely unaware of the commentary or choosing to ignore it. This only frustrated David more. How dare this shabby person not even acknowledge his existence? The cabin crew began their final preparations for departure. David fastened his seatbelt, making sure the Hermes belt buckle of his slacks was visible above it. He pulled out the latest issue of Forbes from the seat pocket. He'd already read it, but it made for good show. "Sir, could you please put your phone in airplane mode?" a flight attendant asked the casual man across the aisle. He looked up for the first time, and David caught a glimpse of intense, intelligent eyes. "Just sending one last important email," the man replied quietly, his voice carrying an unexpected note of authority. Something about his tone made David pause, but he quickly dismissed the feeling. After all, he was the real success story here. As the plane pushed back from the gate, David settled into his seat, satisfied with establishing his dominance in the cabin's social hierarchy. Little did he know, his carefully constructed world was about to be turned upside down, and the man he'd been so quick to judge would soon teach him a lesson he'd never forget. The engines roared to life, and with them, the beginning of a story that would change David's perspective forever. But for now, he sat there, blissfully unaware of the humbling experience that awaited him at cruising altitude. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dimming with a soft ding. David had already finished his first glass of champagne and was ready for another. He'd spent the climb scrolling through his social media, making sure to hold his phone at an angle where others could see his follow count. 30,000 followers didn't just happen by accident, he thought proudly. "Excuse me," he called out to a passing flight attendant, raising his empty glass with a practiced flourish. "I believe it's time for a refill." The attendant nodded politely and headed to the galley. David noticed how the man across the aisle was still glued to his phone, now with a small notebook balanced on his knee, scribbling what looked like calculations and rough sketches. "I suppose that's what passes for work these days," David said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Drawing little pictures and calling yourself an entrepreneur." He let out a laugh that was just a touch too loud to be natural. A few passengers glanced his way, but most seemed more interested in their own activities. The flight attendant returned with his champagne. As she handed it to him, David noticed her stopping at his neighbor's seat. "Would you like anything to drink, sir?" she asked the casually dressed man. "Just water, thanks," he replied, barely looking up from his notebook. His voice was surprisingly deep and measured, carrying a quiet confidence that irritated David even more. "Water?" David scoffed. "I guess that's all you can afford on your startup salary." He took a long sip of his champagne, making sure everyone could see his expensive watch as he raised the glass to his lips. A young woman a few rows ahead turned around to look at them, her eyes widening slightly as she glanced at David's neighbor. She quickly turned back around and whispered something to her companion. David interpreted this as agreement with his commentary. "You know," he continued, warming to his theme, "I was in San Francisco last week for a board meeting. You wouldn't believe what they've done to that city. Every coffee shop is full of these wannabe tech geniuses with their laptops and big dreams." He paused for effect. "But you know what? Real success doesn't come from playing with computers all day." The man across the aisle continued his work, now drawing what appeared to be some kind of rocket design. David leaned over slightly to get a better look, his curiosity momentarily overcoming his disdain. The sketches were surprisingly detailed, with complex equations scrawled in the margins. "Oh, designing rocket ships, are we?" David's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Let me guess, another Silicon Valley dreamer who thinks he's going to colonize Mars." He laughed at his own joke, but this time no one joined in. In fact, several passengers were now watching the scene with what looked like second-hand embarrassment. The man finally looked up from his notebook, meeting David's gaze for the first time. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, carrying a weight that made David's next words catch in his throat. But the man simply gave a small, knowing smile and returned to his work. This supple dismissal only fueled David's irritation. "I've been in business for 20 years, he announced to the cabin at large. "I've seen all these tech bubbles come and go. These days, anyone with a hoodie and a PowerPoint presentation thinks they're the next Steve Jobs." A flight attendant approached with the lunch menu, but David wasn't finished. "You probably don't even know who Steve Jobs is, do you?" he directed at his neighbor. "Too busy playing with your social media apps and cryptocurrency scams." The elderly gentleman by the window cleared his throat. "Sir, perhaps we could all enjoy a quieter flight." His tone was polite but firm. "I'm just making conversation," David replied defensively. "Some of us actually worked for our success. We didn't just get lucky with some app or catch the right trend at the right time." The man in the t-shirt was now typing something on his phone, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen. David noticed several other passengers looking at their own phones, some of them smiling slightly as they read something. "Breaking news about your startup," David quipped. "Let me guess, another revolutionary app that's going to change the world." He made air quotes around the word revolutionary. Just then, another flight attendant approached their row. She leaned down slightly toward the man in the t-shirt, speaking in a low voice that David could still hear clearly. "Mr. Musk, would you prefer the chef's special for lunch today? The kitchen made sure to prepare it exactly as you liked it on your last flight." The words hit David like a bucket of ice water. His champagne glass froze halfway to his lips as the realization slowly dawned on him. The color drained from his face as the past 30 minutes of his commentary played back in his mind. The cabin fell silent, except for the quiet hum of the engines. David sat there, his mouth slightly open, as the magnitude of his mistake began to sink in. He had just spent the better part of an hour insulting one of the most influential entrepreneurs in the world. The silence in the first-class cabin felt heavier than ever. David sat frozen in his seat, his half-empty champagne glass still suspended in midair as the reality of the situation washed over him in waves. He had just spent nearly an hour mocking Elon Musk, the actual Elon Musk, about rockets, technology, and entrepreneurship. The flight attendant was still standing there, waiting for Musk's lunch preference. "The usual would be fine, thank you," Musk replied with a small smile, as casual as if he were ordering coffee at a local diner. His humble response only made David feel worse. David's hands began to shake slightly as he carefully set his champagne glass down. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him, some amused, others disapproving. The elderly gentleman by the window was poorly concealing a smile behind his newspaper. A couple in the row ahead were whispering to each other, occasionally glancing back. I didn't," David stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. His collar suddenly felt too tight, and he could feel beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The same Rolex watch he'd been so proudly displaying earlier now felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds on his wrist. A young tech enthusiast 2 rows ahead couldn't contain himself any longer. "Mr. Musk, I just wanted to say that SpaceX's latest launch was incredible. The way the booster landed, it was like watching science fiction become reality." His eyes were bright with genuine admiration. Musk looked up from his notebook, giving the young man a genuine smile. "Thank you. The team worked incredibly hard on that one. There were some interesting challenges with the atmospheric re-entry calculations." He began explaining the technical details with obvious passion, using his notebook to sketch out some of the concepts. David watched in mounting horror as other passengers began to engage in the conversation. A woman mentioned how her Tesla had practically saved her life during a near accident. Another passenger talked about how his son was inspired to study engineering because of SpaceX. Each story twisted the knife of embarrassment deeper into David's gut. His mind raced back through every condescending comment he'd made. The jab about rocket ships to the man who had actually revolutionized space travel. The sneering remarks about apps and technology to someone who had helped create PayPal. The comment about colonizing Mars to the very person who had made it a serious possibility rather than just science fiction. The cabin crew were now moving through with lunch service, but David had completely lost his appetite. He could smell the delicious aroma of freshly prepared meals, but his stomach was tied in knots. The same flight attendant he'd been so dismissive to earlier approached his seat. "Would you like the chicken or the beef, sir?" she asked professionally, giving no indication that she'd witnessed his earlier behavior. I'm not very hungry," David managed to mumble. From the corner of his eye, he could see Musk sketching something new in his notebook, apparently unbothered by the commotion around him or David's earlier remarks. A notification sound drew David's attention to his own phone. His social media feeds were suddenly exploding with activity. Someone on the flight had tweeted about the incident, and it was already going viral. "You won't believe what just happened on my flight," the tweet began. David quickly turned off his phone, his face burning with shame. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just an hour ago, he'd been proudly displaying his social media following. Now he was hiding from it. His 30,000 followers seemed insignificant compared to Musk's millions, just as his own achievements felt smaller in the presence of someone who was genuinely changing the world. More passengers were engaging with Musk now, asking thoughtful questions about electric vehicles, renewable energy, and space exploration. He answered each one with patience and enthusiasm, sometimes pulling up actual data on his phone to illustrate a point. There was no trace of the arrogance or condescension that David had displayed earlier. The same notebook David had mocked was now being used to explain complex engineering concepts in simple terms that everyone could understand. The casual t-shirt and jeans that he judged so harshly were clearly the uniform of someone too busy doing actual work to worry about impressing others. A child from business class who had sneaked up to use the first-class bathroom stopped in his tracks when he recognized Musk. His eyes went wide with wonder. Without hesitation, Musk paused his conversation to give the young boy a fist bump and encourage his interest in science. The contrast between this genuine interaction and David's earlier behavior made him sink even lower in his seat. The hours that had seemed to drag by earlier now felt like they were racing past. Each minute brought new reminders of David's mistaken judgments and prejudices. He found himself wishing desperately for turbulence, an emergency landing, anything to end this flight sooner. But the plane continued its smooth journey eastward, leaving David to stew in the consequences of his actions. The lunch service had ended, and David sat quietly picking at his untouched bread roll, still too embarrassed to look across the aisle. His phone remained off, safely tucked away in his pocket, a stark change from his earlier behavior of flaunting it. The supple drone of the engines seemed to mock his silence, the same silence he'd so rudely interrupted earlier with his loud comments. Then something unexpected happened. Musk turned toward him, his expression neither angry nor mocking, but genuinely interested. "You mentioned you've been in business for 20 years, he said, his voice carrying that same quiet confidence David had dismissed earlier. "What's the biggest challenge you faced?" David nearly choked on his water. He hadn't expected this, not kindness, not interest, and certainly not after his earlier behavior. He dabbed his mouth with a napkin, buying time to compose himself. Well, he stuttered, then took a deep breath. "Actually, my biggest challenge was probably my first major failure." Something in Musk's attentive expression encouraged him to continue. "It was 2008, during the financial crisis. I had just invested everything into expanding our marketing firm. We lost almost all our clients within 3 months." David surprised himself with his honesty. He'd never told this story to anyone outside his family. 2008 was rough, Musk nodded, turning slightly in his seat. "Tesla and SpaceX both nearly went bankrupt that year. I had to choose between putting my last bit of money into one company or splitting it between both and watching them both die." David's eyes widened. He'd read about this in business magazines, but hearing it directly from the source was different. "How did you handle that kind of pressure?" he asked, genuinely curious now. "One day at a time," Musk replied, pulling out his notebook again. "Here, let me show you something." He sketched a quick diagram. "When everything's falling apart, people usually focus on the big picture, the whole mountain they need to climb. But sometimes you need to just focus on the next step." For the next hour, the conversation flowed naturally. David found himself sharing real stories about his struggles and successes, not the exaggerated versions he'd been spouting earlier. Musk listened intently, occasionally offering insights from his own experiences. "You know what's interesting about innovation?" Musk said, using his notebook to illustrate a point. "It's not always about creating something new. Sometimes it's about looking at existing problems differently." He showed David a rough sketch of an electric car battery design. Everyone said electric cars were impossible because batteries were too expensive. Instead of accepting that, we asked why they were expensive and worked backward. Other passengers listened in, occasionally contributing their own thoughts. The elderly gentleman by the window turned out to be a retired engineer who had worked on early electric vehicle prototypes. He joined the discussion, sharing fascinating stories about the evolution of the technology. David found himself taking mental notes, not for social media posts or to impress others, but because he was genuinely learning. The same notebook he'd mocked earlier was now filled with insights that made him rethink his entire approach to business. "Marketing is crucial," Musk acknowledged, surprising David. but it has to be authentic. When you believe in what you're doing, when you're genuinely trying to solve problems, the story tells itself. He pulled up some early SpaceX launch videos on his phone. We didn't need fancy advertisements. The rockets landing themselves was all the marketing we needed. The conversation shifted to broader topics. They discussed the future of work, the importance of continuous learning, and the real meaning of success. David noticed how Musk's eyes lit up when talking about potential innovations that could help solve global problems. You know what's funny? David finally said, gathering his courage. I spent years thinking success was about looking successful. Nice clothes, expensive watches, first-class seats. He glanced down at his Rolex, which somehow seemed less important now. But sitting here, listening to you talk about actual innovation and problem-solving, I realize I've been focused on the wrong things. Musk smiled. The best thing about success is that it gives you the opportunity to tackle bigger problems. Money, status, they're just tools. The real question is, what are you going to build with those tools? A flight attendant passed by, refilling their water glasses. David noticed how Musk thanked her by name, asking about her studies. Apparently, they talked earlier when David was too busy showing off to notice. She was working on her engineering degree while flying full-time. Speaking of building things, Musk said, turning to a fresh page in his notebook, I'm curious about your thoughts on something. He began sketching out a marketing challenge SpaceX was facing, how to communicate complex technical achievements to the general public without losing the scientific accuracy. David found himself fully engaged, offering insights from his years of marketing experience, but now from a place of genuine desire to help rather than ego. Other passengers joined in, turning the first-class cabin into an impromptu think tank. As they bounced ideas back and forth, David realized something profound. The respect he'd been so desperately seeking earlier came naturally now that he was being authentic and contributing real value. The same passengers who had cringed at his earlier behavior were now actively engaging with his ideas. As the flight continued eastward, the first-class cabin had transformed into something unexpected. The invisible walls of status and pretense that David had worked so hard to build earlier had completely melted away. He watched in quiet amazement as Musk engaged with everyone around him, from the young flight attendant pursuing her engineering dreams to the cleaning crew member who had a fascinating idea about improving airplane waste management. The real eye-opener came during a moment of turbulence. While David instinctively gripped his armrests, he noticed how Musk calmly continued his conversation with a college student who had wandered up from economy class. The student was shaking, clearly nervous about both the turbulence and speaking to his idol, but Musk put him at ease with a simple question about his studies. So you're working on sustainable energy solutions? Musk asked the student, genuinely interested. What made you choose that field? The student's face lit up as he explained his project, a low-cost solar panel system for rural communities. David found himself leaning in to listen, forgetting about the turbulence entirely. He was a young person with nothing to his name except a brilliant idea and burning passion, exactly the kind of person David would have dismissed hours earlier. You know, Musk said to the group that had gathered around, everyone talks about success like it's a destination, but it's more like a journey where the scenery keeps changing. He pulled out his notebook again, sketching a simple diagram. When I started, I thought success meant making PayPal work. Then it was about making electric cars viable. Then launching rockets. Now it's about getting to Mars and transitioning to sustainable energy. David thought about his own definition of success, how it had been stuck on the same page for years. Corner office, expensive suits, first-class tickets. He looked down at his designer watch again, seeing it differently now. I've been measuring success in all the wrong ways, he admitted out loud. A flight attendant who had been quietly listening shared her perspective. I see all kinds of people in first class, she said. Some of the most successful ones are the ones you'd never guess were successful. They're too busy doing important things to worry about looking important. Musk nodded in agreement. The best meetings I've ever had were in t-shirts and jeans, he said with a slight smile, making everyone chuckle as they remembered David's earlier comments about proper business attire. The conversation shifted to stories of humble beginnings and valuable failures. The elderly engineer shared how his biggest innovation came after his most embarrassing professional mistake. The college student talked about his failed experiments that led to unexpected discoveries. Even the flight attendant shared how losing her previous job had pushed her to pursue her real passion for engineering. David found himself sharing more about his own journey, but this time without the embellishments and bravado. He talked about the sleepless nights during the 2008 crisis, the tough decisions, the moments of doubt. To his surprise, people engaged more with his authentic stories than they had with his boasting earlier. That's the thing about failure, Musk said, drawing another diagram in his notebook. It's not the opposite of success, it's a component of success. He showed how each failed rocket landing had provided data for the successful ones. The same principle applies to any field. Every setback teaches you something if you're willing to learn. The young flight attendant brought fresh coffee for everyone, and David noticed how differently he treated her now. Instead of barely acknowledging her existence as he had earlier, he found himself genuinely thanking her and asking about her engineering studies. Her eyes lit up as she described her thesis project, and David realized she was probably smarter than most of his executive team. A child walking past their row stopped and stared at Musk's notebook, fascinated by the rocket drawings. Instead of shooing him away, Musk spent a few minutes explaining the basics of rocket science in terms the boy could understand. David watched in amazement as complex physics concepts were broken down into simple, engaging explanations that even he could follow. The biggest barrier to learning, Musk explained after the boy returned to his seat, is thinking we already know everything. The moment you become too proud to ask stupid questions is the moment you stop growing. David thought about all the questions he'd been afraid to ask over the years, all the times he'd nodded along in meetings pretending to understand things he didn't, all because he thought successful people were supposed to know everything. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows. David looked at his reflection in the darkened window and barely recognized himself. The man who had boarded the plane in San Francisco seemed like a stranger now, all polished surface and no substance. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into New York. David couldn't believe how quickly the flight had passed. It felt like just minutes ago he had been strutting onto the plane, looking down at everyone around him. Now, as the plane began its approach to JFK Airport, he felt like a completely different person. "I need to apologize," David said, turning to face Musk directly. "The way I acted earlier, it was completely out of line. I was trying so hard to prove I belonged in first class that I forgot what really matters." Musk closed his notebook and gave David his full attention. "You know what's interesting about belonging?" he said thoughtfully. "The people who really belong somewhere never need to prove it. They're too busy creating value to worry about status." The plane descended through a layer of clouds, the late afternoon sun painting the cabin in warm golden light. Other passengers began gathering their belongings, but the conversation in their row continued. "I've been thinking," David said, his voice carrying a new humility. "All those things I said about tech entrepreneurs and startups, I was really just afraid. Afraid that the world is changing too fast, afraid that my way of doing business might become obsolete." Musk nodded understandingly. "Change is scary," he agreed, "but it's also inevitable. The question isn't whether things will change, but whether we'll be part of shaping that change or just complaining about it." The flight attendant who had been following their conversation throughout the flight approached with their jackets. David noticed how Musk helped her adjust a heavy bag in the overhead compartment, despite being in the middle of their conversation. "You know," the flight attendant added, "I've worked this route for 6 years. The passengers who make the biggest fuss about their status are usually the ones most unsure of themselves." She smiled warmly at David. "The real leaders, the true innovators, they lift others up instead of putting them down." David thought about his team back at the office, how he'd been treating them lately. Had his need to prove himself made him push others down? He made a mental note to make some changes when he got back. As the plane touched down with a gentle thud, Musk reached into his simple backpack, the same one David had sneered at earlier. He pulled out a business card and handed it to David. "If you're serious about wanting to make a difference," he said, "send me an email. We're always looking for people who understand both traditional business and the need for innovation." David took the card with slightly trembling hands. It was surprisingly simple, no fancy titles or gold embossing, just a clean design with an email address. The simplicity spoke volumes. Other passengers began standing up, retrieving their bags. The college student who had shared his solar panel ideas walked past, and Musk called out to him. "Send me the details of your project," he said. "My team might be interested." The young man's face lit up with joy and disbelief. As they prepared to disembark, David reached for his designer briefcase, but it somehow felt different in his hands. "You've given me a lot to think about," he said to Musk. "I came on this flight thinking I knew everything about success, but I'm leaving with more questions than answers." "That's usually a good sign," Musk replied with a slight smile. "Questions lead to learning, and learning leads to growth. Just remember, the real measure of success isn't in how many people look up to you, but in how many people you help to rise." The elderly engineer who had been sitting quietly nearby stood up and added his perspective. "In my 50 years of working, I've learned that true innovation comes from collaboration, not competition. It's not about being better than others, it's about making things better for others." As they walked through the jet bridge into JFK Airport, David noticed how Musk stopped to thank each crew member by name. Despite being surely one of the busiest people on the plane, he took the time to acknowledge everyone who had made their journey possible. In the terminal, a small crowd had gathered. Some had obviously heard through social media that Musk was on the flight. But before heading toward them, he turned to David one last time. "One more thing," Musk said, pulling out his notebook one last time. He quickly wrote something and handed the page to David. It was a simple drawing of a staircase, with words written on each step: curiosity, humility, learning, innovation, impact. "Success isn't about reaching the top," he explained. "It's about helping others climb with you." David carefully folded the paper and put it in his wallet, right where he used to keep a photo of his first Rolex. As he watched Musk walk away, surrounded by excited fans, but still in his simple black t-shirt and jeans, David realized that this 6-hour flight had taught him more about success than 20 years in business. He pulled out his phone, finally ready to turn it back on. But instead of checking his social media or email, he opened the Notes app and began writing. "Things to change when I get back to the office." The list grew longer with each step he took toward the exit, and for the first time in years, he felt truly excited about going to work tomorrow.